Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to be modeling our front fender from our GPZ build series. So if you haven't seen the previous episode, we talked about what we're doing and why, and in this video, we're going to go step by step through the process of modeling this. Now, I have had some requests to talk more about scanning and bringing scans into Fusion. We're going to be doing that on the next episode, which is the upper triple clamp. That one really requires a more detailed scan, so it's a better sort of part for that process. In this one, if you want to go to the description of the video, you can download the data set, which includes a flat plate, which is going to be sort of the mounting plane that we're going to use for the fender. I've got a sort of a mock tire surface here, and there's also a scan. And the scan is going to have some of that detail. You can see there's a tire in there for some of the areas that we're concerned about, and we can see the forks. But again, as I mentioned in the previous video, we don't really need to get a super high detailed scan for what we're doing. We just need some of the basic geometry in 3D to work with. So in this video, if you want to follow along and use the scan data, or you want to use the basic bodies, you certainly can. I'm going to be focusing on these basic bodies. And again, this is something that you could do with just a couple measurements and making sure you understand the rough geometry that you have to work with. The end goal is going to be a body that is partially freeform, partially standard surfaces, and we're going to walk through the process of how to model that. It's actually a really simple part, so it shouldn't take very long, but there are going to be a few things that we should understand. The first thing that we want to understand is the decision to use freeform modeling instead of a traditional surface. Now, freeform modeling is going to give us the flexibility to just push and pull the shape pretty easily. We don't necessarily need the scan or the reference geometry of the tire and the plate to do that, but it does help to have those. If you have a solid body or a surface body in a design and you have it visible, so in this case, they're currently shown, when we go to start a new freeform model, they'll be in the sort of the freeform environment as these ghosted images. They're no longer going to show up in the bodies folder, which means that we can't turn them on or off. The only way to do that is to finish the form and hide them and go back and edit the form, and then they won't be shown. So if you want to use this type of geometry, either a solid body or a surface body with a freeform model, then it does need to be visible at the time you either create or edit that freeform body. So make sure that you do have whichever one visible you want. You can toggle on and off the mesh body pretty easily. That can be done whether or not you're in the freeform environment or just the standard design. As I said, I am going to be using just the simple geometry and not the scan for our video, but the scan is still in the design if you want to follow along with it. So now that we've got the basic shape, we've got our plate, we've got our tire, and this is roughly the right profile. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're not creating something that's a highly precise engineered surface. It's just going to be something cosmetic. It just needs to be fairly close. If you look at the scan and you look at the shape of the basic bodies that I have here, the surface and the solid, you can see that they're very close. They're not perfect because I just eyeballed it, but they're very close. So what we want to do is we want to think about how to start our freeform model. I'm going to give you a couple of different ways to do this, and I'm going to talk about sort of the pros and cons of it. The first way is to start with a cylinder. We need to pick the right plane, and then we need to figure out where we want to start the sketch. Now, the problem with this is we don't have a center point location because our coordinate system is actually based off that top plate. So I need to come down here and roughly get it right. And then I want to put this about where we want the fender. It doesn't have to be perfect at this point, but just get it close. I'm going to rotate this around. We're going to make this symmetric. So we're going to use mirror symmetry. We can say symmetric here as well. Then we're going to do our height symmetry and then play around with this geometry. We want to make sure that the number of height faces is only 2 because we're going to be adding to it. And then we want to pull this in as narrow as we feel we need. This is going to be the center section, and we're going to play around with that shape a little bit. We're going to say, okay. I'm going to go back to a side view, and then I'm going to delete what I don't need. So basically getting rid of most of it by just hitting delete. Now with freeform modeling, what you're going to notice is that the geometry of each piece or each face that we're dealing with is based on the surrounding geometry. So as soon as I deleted the rest of that cylinder, it's no longer going to it's not going to keep that shape. It's not like if we were taking an arc and extruding it as a surface, it's going to sort of unwind itself or spring back. And that's because the tangency at this open edge is going to assume that it's a straight line. If we added another edge to this by double clicking, going to modify, we're going to hold down the Alt key and pull this down. Now what we're doing is we're starting to drive that shape a bit more. So keep in mind that if you are starting with a cylinder, you're going to have that potential problem, because as soon as we start to get rid of some of that geometry, then it's going to basically unspring or unwind itself. So the way that I'm going to start this is I'm going to start with a sketch on that same sort of right plane, and I'm just going to use an arc. But before I do that, I want to create some visual reference lines. So I want to figure out where I want this to go to, and I need it to be basically a little bit shorter on the front. We can project using P on the keyboard. You can also go to Create, Project, Include, and find it here. And then I'm going to give a dimension from this front edge to here. I want this to be probably about 130 millimeters. And then on the back side, we're going to go to 150. And this is where having a scan of the original Fender would help, because you visually would be able to see where it is. And I do have a variation of the scan that has that, but honestly, it's not important for us because this is just a sort of a general idea on how to do this for us. So escape to get off our dimension tool. We're going to convert these to construction. You can do this with X on the keyboard if you want. And now we know about where we want the front to be and the back to be. We can do this with a spline. We can do this with an arc. And I'm going to use an arc in this case. I'm going to snap here, and then just draw my arc to be roughly above the tire. Hit escape, and then we can play around with this if we want. Remember that from this upper edge here, we're going to be creating a surface that comes down to the fender. And this upper section, we don't want it to hug the fender, but we do want it to get fairly close. Once we're happy with that, we'll finish the sketch. We'll go to Create and select Extrude. And now we'll pull this out to create our new shape. We want to make sure that we are using symmetric and embedded symmetry. This is going to put that symmetric line. We don't need to extrude it out much. In this case, it says 20 millimeters. We can modify that. But now we've got our starting shape. And because it has more divisions, it's got more edges here, then it's going to hold its shape much better than that original cylinder. So now that we've got the starting point shape, now is where we really need to begin working with our freeform tools, specifically Edit Form and Insert Point. What I want to do is I want to start by double clicking this left edge, going to a front or a back view. I'm going to zoom in a bit, and I'm going to pull this down. And the reason for that is because I'm starting to create the shape of the tire. Once I have that, there are two of these sort of next steps that we can do. And what I mean by that is we can either extrude by holding down Alt and pull this out to continue to create that shape, or we can use a scaling trick that we've done in the past where we go to a side view, we reset our pivot point, we're going to reset it to the center of the tire, we're going to hit the green check mark, we're going to hold down Alt, but this time we're going to scale it inward. And the main benefit here is that when we extrude, it's going to come out straight, which means that the front is going to have a little bit of a wiggle in it. When we use the scale trick, it's going to be coming down toward the center point, which means that the geometry is likely going to be a bit better. What we still need to do is pull this out because we don't want it pinching the tire, but this is going to give us, again, that sort of rough shape. Now that we've got the rough shape of the fender, what we need to do is we need to work on trimming the front. I find it pretty useful to go into our box display, which is going to be Alt and 1. You can also go to your selection options down here and go back and forth between smooth and box. And the reason for this is because I want these edges to not come straight down. I want them to transition backwards. So I'm going to start with just manually moving some points, trying to keep the move in the same orientation. So what I mean by that is I want to assume that this point is just traveling along this edge. And then I'm going to move this one as well. We're going to look at a different way to do this on the back edge. This is just to get started. Now, if we go to the back edge, I'd also note that this process, sometimes you'll see it hangs up and it's thinking. When we've got a large mesh in a design, it does tend to cause some delays. In this case, it's not responding. It's okay, we just need to let it calculate. But I've noticed that when we have large mesh files, especially messy ones like this, sometimes it causes some delays. So if you're not using the mesh, feel free to right click and delete it. It's not used anywhere, so you can delete it and get rid of it. So what I'm going to do on the back side is instead I'm going to use insert point. I'm going to come from our symmetry line, and I'm just going to start to work my way back. And I'm actually going to create a triangle here and say OK. And the main reason for that is because now I want to select each of these edges, just holding down the Shift key, and then use delete. Delete on the keyboard to get rid of those. Alt and 3 to go back to smooth, and now we've created that smooth transition on the back. On the front side, we still have this sort of hanging out in space, so we need to do the same trick of insert point and sort of cut that corner and delete it. So that'll give us that nice smooth transition. We could stop here, but if we want to add any more shape, maybe we want to make the front a little bit more pointed or change the shape from the front to the rear, now's the time that we could do that. And we can do that with a couple of different tools. Again, modify. If I select an edge, I can turn on soft modification. And looking at the dots, we've got red, pink, and white, and then we've got sections with no dots. This is going to be the distance that it's going to affect the shape. So this is a good way to do gradual transitions between shapes. It allows us to make some very minor tweaks, and you can play around with the settings for how that progresses. Right now it's using a circular extent. It's just a distance away from this point, but you could do a square or rectangular face count, and then you can kind of dictate that. So again, you can play around with this. If you want the front or the back to have a little bit of a different shape, you can do that. Another thing that's important to mention is you may end up seeing some graphical blips like this. Now, in cases like that, sometimes these are going to just be graphics, and it's not actually a problem with the form. You can always go into utilities and repair body and see if there is an actual problem, like a red error star point or T point. There's not in this case. We can also use tools like make uniform, which is going to take all of the sort of divisions, the faces on this, and try to make them the same size. But really the test is for us to finish the form and then just make sure, let's go ahead and hide some of this stuff. Just make sure that there isn't actually a problem there. Most of the time when you find it in the middle of an edge like that, it's really just going to be a graphics glitch. So I think this is a pretty good shape. Again, I don't really need to worry too much about making something that is perfect at this stage. This is just something that we want to be able to explore shapes and play with. The beauty of the freeform model is we can always come back and make a copy of this. So Control C and Control V, and then we can play around with the copy. So let's say that maybe we wanted to add some extra detail here. I'm going to go to Modify, Bevel Edge, and let's set this to relative offset and make it a bit tighter. And then I'm going to take this edge, use Edit Form, maybe pull it up and out a little bit. And now if I hide the edges with Control and 4, you can see that I've made that sort of sharper edge that happens right here. It's still a smooth transition. It's still curvature continuous, but it does give me a little bit of a different look in the details. So you can see that there. You can also see that graphics glitch that's sort of right there. It doesn't show up on the other side, which has symmetry. It's another good indication that it's just a graphics thing, and it's not really a problem with the Fender. This shape doesn't really work for me because it's getting too close to the squared off version, and I don't like that. So that's kind of what we're trying to get away from. But now that we've got this shape, we're going to come back to our finished form. We're going to go to our surface tools, and we're going to use the patch tool and simply select the bottom profile of this rectangle, say OK, and hide that solid body. That we'll come back to that in a little bit. And this is going to be our mounting plate. This is where we're going to attach it to the bike. So next we want to go to Create, and we're going to use a tool called Ruled Surface. This is going to allow us to pull this down. And you can see here as we pull it down that it's actually a bit too wide for the Fender. So there's a couple things that we can do here. we can go back to our freeform model, leaving that shape, even though it happened later in the timeline, it's still going to be here. And then what we can do is we can right click and use edit form and just scale this outward a little bit. So that way it's wider. And if we don't like the profile anymore, we can always make minor tweaks by pulling some of this geometry up. I do strongly suggest if you do that, that you deselect the front and back edges, simply because that's going to be problematic for you. You really want it to leave the border or the profile alone. So once I'm happy with that, I can go ahead and finish the form. And now you can see our surface is outside of that profile. So what we want to do now is use our trim tool. We're going to use the Fender as our trim tool, and we're going to select everything on the inside. Then we're going to right click and repeat. This time we're going to use that box and remove everything on the inside of the Fender. And then we can stitch these together as well as this top piece. This should turn it into one single solid body. If it doesn't, let's go ahead and undo. Make sure that we grab all three of them. We should see green edges everywhere they're connected. I think I may have selected untrim or unstitch, which obviously we don't want to do. And now we can use our fillet tool. Going to round these off. And let's say maybe 15 will be okay. We'll have to maybe play around with this. And then we're going to use F again. And we want to round this off. And 10 millimeters, maybe a bit much, but we're going to go ahead and run with it. And then up here, I'm going to do something a bit more minimal. 3 is going to be the distance that I want to thicken this, so I'm going to use 3 millimeters here. And then I'm going to use my Create Thicken, and I'm going to thicken this a distance of -3 millimeters. So we should get a solid body now. The inside will have a sharp corner here simply because the thickness distance matches that radius. So as you move in 3 millimeters, it's going to disappear. And I also have a sketch called Hole Pattern. And so now we want to use our solid tools, Extrude, to take each of these holes and just pull them down into the part. We can use Distance Through All and say OK. And now we've got a part that we can try out on the bike. Now, I think that this deserves a little bit of back and forth and playing with in order to get the final shape. Like for me, looking at this, I think that this is too tall, which means likely I want to go from the front here and I would raise the middle section up higher. So that way I'm really dealing with less of this big bulky piece here. If we take a look at the one that I printed for the video, you can see that the actual arc piece is a bit higher. But again, it's just a little bit of back and forth to play around with the design. The last thing would be to separate this up for 3D printing. If you have a printer that can print the entire thing, that's great. In most cases, it's going to be too tall. So what we want to do is we're going to break this up. Depending on where your coordinate system is located, you can simply use split body. Bodies to split will be the Fender, and then we're just going to use the plane, and that'll break it up right in the middle. If you don't have that option, then what you can do is just draw a single line and use that line to split it up in the same way. Now that we've got the pieces, we want to send each one to a 3D printer. I'm going to send it to Bamboo Labs, and we'll just set it up in Bamboo Studio. And this will give us the ability to decide how it's going to be printed and whether or not it actually fits. The way that I printed the one that's on the bike now is I flipped it so that this flat section was on the platform, the build platform. And then I used a brim around the outside just to give it a little bit of extra support, and then I sliced it. Because of the geometry, it's really beneficial to think about support material. This section being so tall on this version of the Fender, it really would need some support in here, or these faces would need to be tapered. The version that I actually printed, that's a bit thinner. This printed fine without support, again, because the geometry was so much closer to this. But once again, the entire point of this is just to understand how we can design these parts. That way we've got the idea, the concept behind it, the flexibility to create our own designs, and then we can iterate from here. In terms of printing these, this size using kind of a standard PLA or a hyper PLA setting, it printed each piece in about 1.5 to 2 hours. You could print it a little bit faster, but I found that getting up closer to the ends, printing it faster ended up leaving some imperfections on the inside. It's perfectly fine for a mock-up or a concept, and obviously it would need to be painted and smoothed out if it's going to be used for the final mold. But for right now, again, it's good enough to just get on the bike and test it out. What I would suggest strongly is spending some time playing around in the freeform environment to better understand how to play around with that. On this channel, we've got lots of videos on that, from doing everything from like ear pods to motorcycle helmets to entire cars and car parts. So plenty of videos on that topic on this channel where you can play around and learn freeform modeling a bit more if you want to add some more detail to these types of parts. But if you have any questions on this, please let me know. We're going to be doing our next video on the upper triple clamp for this series. So that's going to allow us to take a look at doing some more mechanical parts. We're going to be doing a scan with the Metro X. So we'll talk more about the scanning process and actually getting that scan into not only the RevoScan software, but we'll take a look at it in Quick Surface as an option. And then we'll also bring it into Fusion, obviously, and begin designing our own triple clamp. So again, if you have any questions, please leave comments below. If you like what you see here, consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.